Let me take you to Dilley, Texas. If you've never heard of it, I understand. It's a very small South Texas town that sits alongside Interstate 35. It's about halfway between San Antonio and the border town of Laredo. The community's roots go back to the 1860s. Dilley grew up along the Great Northern Railroad that connected San Antonio to Mexico by the 1880s. It's been a site for oil exploration and commercial shipping. They ship peanuts from there, produce and livestock. Dilley, Texas is home to about 4,000 people, about 3,500 people, which again is why you may not have heard of it. It once proclaimed itself the watermelon capital of Texas, and the town's enthusiastic motto is, to this day, a slice of the good life. But today, right now, being in Dilley is anything but the good life for hundreds of people who are being held there by the federal government, because the town is also home to the Dilley Immigration Processing Center, which is just one of many immigration centers across the country. But what makes it stand out is that it's one of the few that house entire families. Families. We're talking about children along with their parents. They're sent to Dilley from all over the country and locked up. ProPublica reports that as of earlier this month, more than 750 families were being housed there, nearly half of which included children. Since the start of the Trump second administration, the number of children in ICE detention has skyrocketed, increasing sixfold. The Marshall Project analyzed data obtained by the Deportation Data Project and found ICE to be holding around 170 children on an average day in the Trump administration. The Marshall Project's analysis also found that on some days, ICE held 400 or more children. And that data only runs through mid-October of last year, meaning it doesn't include the recent surge in arrests and enforcement operations in Minnesota. ProPublica received letters in mid-January from several children who were being held at Dilley. All but two of them had been living in the United States when they were detained. In fact, in their own words and drawings, they express how much they miss simple comforts of home and the pain of feeling confined. They talk about missing their friends and their teachers, about falling behind in school, about not always being able to see a doctor when they're sick. And some of them say they're sick a lot. More than anything, they share how scared they are about what the future may hold. Here's a picture. It's drawn by a 5-year-old from Venezuela who had recently crossed the U.S.-Mexico border. At the top, the child titled the picture, Mi Familia, my family. 14-year-old Ariana from Honduras, who had been living in Hicksville, New York, and has been in the United States for 7 years, had already been detained for 45 days when she wrote her letter. Ariana, who's since been released along with her mother, was detained after appearing for a regular check-in at an ICE office. While detained, Ariana was separated from younger siblings for the first time in her life. She wrote, quote, "I've never felt so much fear to go to a place as I feel here. Every time I remind myself that once I go back to Honduras, a lot of dangerous things could happen to my mom. And my younger siblings haven't been able to see their mom in more than a month. They're very young, and you need both of your parents when you're growing up. Since I got to the center, all you will feel is sadness and mostly depression." Another 14-year-old, Gabby from Colombia, had been living in Houston, Texas. She'd been detained for 20 days when she wrote the following, quote, "The workers treat the residents inhumanely, verbally, and I don't want to imagine how they would act if they were unsupervised. I made friends here, and they told me how they've been here for 7 months, and I get really surprised because I can't imagine how bad and sad and stressed being here." Ender, a 12-year-old girl from Venezuela who was living in Austin, Texas, described spending more than 60 days in detention. "They told me I could only be here 21 days, but I've already spent more than 60 days waking up, eating the same repetitive meals, going outside, and that the majority of guards never pay attention to people. Eating dinner always the same as the day before, seeing people cry every day for the same reasons, trying to sleep in that horrible, uncomfortable bed, going to the doctor, and the only thing they tell you is drink more water, and the worst thing is that it seems like the water is what makes people sick here. Going to wait for the bad answers from the judges, hearing the bad news from people who no longer have hope, having to share a room with a minimum 3 families, and all so they send us back to our countries." In a statement to ProPublica, the Department of Homeland Security said all detainees at Dilley are, quote, "being provided with proper medical care." The agency declined to answer questions about specific detainees, but said all are, quote, "provided with 3 meals a day, clean water, clothing, bedding, showers, soap, and toiletries," adding that, quote, "certified dietitians evaluate their meals." DHS also said, quote, "children have access to teachers, classrooms, and curriculum booklets for math, reading, and spelling," and that detained parents are given the option to have their children deported with them or to place their kids with a caregiver. That's life for this segment of Dilley, Texas's population. It's a place that sits at an inflection point in Trump's deportation program. You may recall this photo of 5-year-old Liam in a Spider-Man backpack and a bunny hat when he was detained by ICE agents in Minnesota. Liam and his father, who have since been released, were detained in Minneapolis and then quickly transferred to Dilley. I mentioned Liam because there's a reason that father and son living in Minneapolis end up being detained in Dilley, Texas. As Ian Millhiser, Vox's senior correspondent, explained this week, the Trump administration has developed a practice of taking people arrested in Minnesota and other places and moving them to Texas, where their lawsuits seeking release are less likely to succeed because they will be heard by the largely Trump-aligned Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. And this is of crucial importance at a time when Trump's masked immigration forces are roaming American streets, occupying American cities, and hauling people away, a huge number of whom are likely being held illegally. ProPublica has been tracking the number of cases filed by people who claim that they are being detained illegally. The numbers are shocking. According to ProPublica's count, immigrants filed more of the cases in the first 13 months of the new Trump administration than in the past 3 presidential administrations combined, including Donald Trump's own first term. Take a look at this graph. On the bottom, you see the number of legal detention challenges across the last administrations, fairly consistent. On the right, all the way on the right, almost looks like it's not on the screen, that's just the last year of Trump's presidency. Those cases have skyrocketed. It's a crisis you can see boiling over in ProPublica's data. As you can see here, detentions rising every week since January of last year, rising significantly starting in September as Donald Trump sent federal troops into American cities. So the Trump administration is locking up a record number of immigrants and sending them quickly to a state where their cases will be heard by the Fifth Circuit federal court that's shown itself to be agreeable to Donald Trump's deeply controversial immigration policies. Joining me now is the author of the important piece that I referenced earlier, which explains exactly why the Trump administration moves these ICE detainees to Texas. Ian Millhiser, he's a senior correspondent for Vox. Millhiser's work focuses on the Supreme Court, the Constitution, and the decline of liberal democracy in the United States. Ian, welcome back to the show. Thank you for being with us, and thank you for your great reporting.
Good to be here. Thank you so much.
In your piece, you reported about the ruling that was handed down by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in the case of Buenrostro Mendez versus Bondi. And you write that if the ruling were to hold up, it would allow the Trump administration to lock up virtually any person captured by federal immigration enforcement for months or longer, regardless of their ties to the United States or the merits of their claim that they are lawfully entitled to remain in this country. It's a complicated lot of thoughts. Tell me what that means.
Right. So there's 2 federal statutes dealing with basically what federal law enforcement is supposed to do with immigrants when they apprehend them. If someone is seeking admission, that's the words that the law uses, seeking admission to the United States, then they can be detained. In fact, in some circumstances, they must be detained while their case is proceeding. But if someone is already present in the United States, they're supposed to get more process. They get a bond hearing. They have the possibility of release. These, the reason why you've seen that spike that you mentioned earlier in immigrants being detained, having to file legal proceedings in order to challenge their detention, is because Trump has started to apply the rules that apply to people at the border to every immigrant in the country. So every person who is rounded up by ICE or by Border Patrol or someone else somewhere in the interior of the United States, they are being sent to mandatory detention as if they had been caught at the border. And it is overwhelming the court system. It is overwhelming the detention facilities. And then on top of that, the Fifth Circuit just ruled that this illegal move that Trump is doing of treating people in the United States as if they were found on the border is in fact legal. And so all Trump has to do is get someone to Texas and they lose their rights.
Tell me about that, because how does somebody who's been detained and shows up in Dilley, Texas, get their case even heard by the Fifth Circuit? What has to happen before the Fifth Circuit even gets that?
Yeah, so there's this really alarming arms race going on between the Trump administration and immigration lawyers who represent these immigrants who are being detained. So the rule under a case that the Supreme Court handed down about a year ago called JGG is that if you are detained, if you're an immigrant, you are detained and you think you're being detained illegally, the only way you can challenge that is to file what is called a habeas petition in the local federal court where you are currently being detained. And so if you are arrested in Minneapolis, so long as you're in Minneapolis, you'd file that case in the District of Minnesota, which is not presided over by the Fifth Circuit, where there's actually still law. But if Trump is able to move you to Texas or to move you to Mississippi or Louisiana, which are the other states in the Fifth Circuit, then you have to file your suit in a court that is within the Fifth Circuit, and that lower court will have to follow the Fifth Circuit's rule, which means that there's mandatory detention. So there's this bizarre arms race where someone is arrested and, first of all, they have to find a lawyer. Hopefully they can find a lawyer. And then if they can find a lawyer, that person has to race to file that petition in the Minnesota courts before ICE can fly the person to Texas, because once they're in Texas, they don't have a right to challenge their detention anymore.
This explains why we see this thing where people get detained and then that day they're flown off to Texas. Right. And we don't understand what was the hurry to get them to Texas. I was reading, when I was introducing this, I was reading things from kids who had been in for 60 days. I thought you couldn't hold a child in that environment for more than 20 days or 3 weeks or so.
I mean, the short answer is whatever the law says, it only matters if you have good courts that are able to enforce the law. And it's not just the Fifth Circuit. A lot of the trial courts in the Fifth, within Texas and within the Fifth Circuit are, very, very right wing, very, very MAGA line. But setting that aside, another huge problem is that the courts are just being overwhelmed by this huge spike of cases. So in Minnesota, the immigrants who have managed to file their case in Minnesota before they were shipped off to Texas, a judge recently complained that the Trump administration isn't complying with over 90 decisions ordering people to be released or ordering the administration to give them some sort of a bond hearing. And the reason why, to some extent, it may be because the Trump administration doesn't want to comply with the court orders. But I think the biggest factor there is that the Trump administration doesn't have enough lawyers, doesn't have enough personnel to actually comply. There are steps when a judge orders someone released. The lawyer for the government has to communicate with the detention facility. There are clerical staff in the detention facility who have to process that order. And Trump surged 3,000 law enforcement officers to Minneapolis without surging the lawyers and other personnel who have to ensure that the law is being complied with.
Ian, how long does this continue for? Is at some point one of these cases from the Fifth Circuit about somebody being held in Dilley makes it to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court says that's not the way the law needs to be interpreted? Like, what's the solution to this?
Yeah, the solution is going to have to be someone's going to have to get this issue to the Supreme Court. The question is how fast the Supreme Court will decide it. I'm fairly confident that the lawyers who lost in the Fifth Circuit are probably preparing a petition asking the Supreme Court to hear the case. There's two ways you can ask the Supreme Court to hear a case. The first is you can go on what's called the merits docket, where you'll get a permanent decision from the Supreme Court that decides what the law means, possibly forever. And that often takes months or years. If someone files a petition in the Supreme Court on the merits docket right now, asking them to reverse that Fifth Circuit decision, we probably aren't getting a decision until June 2027. The other process is you can go on what's called the shadow docket. And on the shadow docket, you get a temporary order that says, until we have time to decide this on the merits docket, we're going to suspend what the Fifth Circuit said. And the question is whether these justices are going to be willing to give a shadow docket order. In the Biden administration, there were two decisions involving very harsh anti-immigrant orders from lower courts where the Supreme Court sat on it for a year. So they refused to issue a shadow docket decision. They eventually decided that the lower court judge was wrong, but the lower court judge's opinion was in effect for a year. And so if the Supreme Court sits on this, that's going to be another year or more that people are being shipped to Texas where they have no rights, even if the Supreme Court eventually in June of 2027 or whenever turns around and says that the Fifth Circuit was wrong.
Ian, I'm always smarter for reading your stuff and hearing you explain it. Thank you. This is a complex issue that my viewers know a lot more about now, so we appreciate it. Ian Millhiser is a senior correspondent at Vox.